All right, guys, welcome to another fun-filled lecture. We are going to begin what will be a four-lecture series on the American Civil War. In my opinion, this is the most significant event in the 19th century, and it may well be the most significant event in all of American history. And the consequences of this conflict had far-reaching extents, far-reaching consequences is what I'm trying to say here. And we'll get to the consequences of the Civil War after we look at the Civil War itself. But what I want to do is I want to spend a couple of weeks looking at some of the more direct causes of the conflict. Now, we have mentioned issues of slavery and states' rights, and I have alluded to some of the central causes of the American Civil War in other lectures, and again, that's because the Civil War is just a really significant event. But we're now in the time period of 1850s, and many different things took place in the latter part of the 1840s and in the 1850s, which really directly contributed to the coming of the American Civil War. And so what I want to do over the next couple days, or this week and next week, is to look at some of those direct causes. Now, historians to this day still debate and discuss what the central causes, or the cause, if you will, of the Civil War was. And I think it's safe to say that slavery was central to the causes of the Civil War, or to the outbreak of the war itself. Now, I would nuance that and say that it isn't necessarily the institution of slavery itself that causes the Civil War, but rather the westward expansion of slavery that causes the war. In fact, many of the things that we will look at this week, time and time again, we see it's an issue over the growth of slavery, not necessarily its mere existence. Just to be mindful, we have to be aware that there is a difference between an abolitionist and someone who is anti-slavery. Abolitionists are individuals like William Lloyd Garrison, John Brown, who we will look at this week. These are individuals who want to see slavery completely eradicated from the United States, and many abolitionists want to see social equality and political equality for newly freed slaves. On the other hand, those who would be anti-slavery, and in many ways, I think, especially as a politician, Abraham Lincoln fell more in line with this way of thinking. Those who were anti-slavery, they were content to have slavery where it already existed. What they didn't want was to see slavery extend or to grow into newly Western territories. Okay, and so we're going to be looking at this tension between abolitionism and anti-slavery, and I think that tension highlights that the central cause of the American Civil War was the westward expansion of slavery. Okay, and indeed, after this lecture is over, I have a video on westward expansion and slavery and the impact on the Civil War that I will ask that you watch. I also have one on the Free Soil Party and the election of 1848, so I'll have you watch that as well after this lecture is over. But if we're looking to try to pinpoint what's the central cause of the Civil War, I would argue that it is the westward expansion of slavery. That stated, and you will see this next week in an activity I'm having you do, you'll see that there are other issues at hand. There's issues of states' rights and federalism. How much authority does the state have versus how much authority does the government, the federal government, have? And many people would argue that the main issue for the Civil War was not slavery, but rather it was an issue of the South and the ability of the South to have the right to do and practice what it wanted to do in practice. Now, of course, the thing that it wants to do in practice is slavery. So, it sort of boils back down to that. But you'll see that there are economic arguments, there are social and political arguments, and so there's a whole spectrum of why the Civil War began. So what I want to do is just highlight some of these issues today and next week. The first two things or topics that we're going to look at, we've actually already talked about in the past, and so I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on them, but they are the Missouri Compromise and the nullification crisis. And the reason why I am bringing these up again is because they do tend to highlight these diverse reasons for why the Civil War began. The Missouri Compromise demonstrates that, yes, slavery and its westward expansion very much was a part of the causes for the Civil War. And again, I would say the most significant cause. But the nullification crisis demonstrates that it wasn't just slavery. There was also issues over states' rights and federalism, as I've already mentioned. And so I begin with these two simply to help us understand that we don't want to boil the causes of the Civil War down to one particular thing, even if the westward expansion of slavery is perhaps the most prominent and dominant cause. So with that, let's dive in to some of the direct causes of the Civil War. Okay, so we've got the Missouri Compromise, and hopefully you guys remember what this was. But basically, in 1820, 1821, you get the state, or the territory rather, of Missouri that wants to organize into a state. Now, there's nothing wrong with organizing a territory. It came out of the Louisiana Purchase. There's nothing wrong with organizing a territory into a state, except the problem for the U.S. at this point was that when Missouri requested to become a state, you have an equal number of slave states and non-slave states. And because representation in the Senate is based upon each state gets 2 senators, well, if you have an equal number of free states and an equal number of slave states, then in the Senate, you have an equal number of senators. In fact, it states here that you had 22 senators from the North, or the non-slave holding states, and 22 from the South. Now, Missouri, there were slaves in Missouri, so when it requested to become a state, this, of course, had it been immediately allowed to happen, this would have upset that delicate balance of power. Because if Missouri had come in as a slave state, then all of a sudden you're going to have in the Senate a majority of interests that would have been for the slave states. And so this upset and concerned a lot of people from the North because they didn't want to have their interests overrode by a majority of people who may have had interests with respects to slavery. Hopefully that makes sense. Now, to address this issue, a compromise is brought to bear. And the compromise is that the United States will balance out that delicate balance of power by bringing in another state. So they take a portion of what was Massachusetts and they create the state of Maine. And so the Missouri Compromise is essentially this. We're going to bring Missouri in as a slave state. So Missouri will be brought in as a slave state, and we will create out of Massachusetts the state of Maine, and we will bring it in as a free state. That would mean then that we went from 22 senators in the North and 22 in the South to 24 from the free states and 24 to the slave states. Politically speaking, the Missouri Compromise achieves nothing. We actually don't change anything whatsoever. We bring in 2 new states, but as far as the politics are concerned, it doesn't address the central issue, right? We still haven't answered the question, what do you do when a new state wants to come in? Should it be a free state? Should it be a slave state? And this is why, or an example of why, I argue that it is westward expansion of slavery, not just the institution of slavery. It is whenever a new state comes in and we have to ask this question, should it be free? Should it be slave, right? That's when the tension comes out. Now, that's the nuts and bolts of the Missouri Compromise, but there's one part that we have to be mindful of. And so I'm going to move on to the next slide and show you a map. So if we take a look at this map, and you've seen this map before when we talked about the Missouri Compromise, you can see you've got Missouri admitted as a slave state in 1821, and if you go to the very top to the north, you see Maine was admitted as a free state in 1820. Okay, but there's a little red line there, the 3630 Compromise line, and that line is incredibly important because what the United States was trying to do in 1820, 1821, was to lay to rest the question of when we get new states, Will they be free? Will they be slave? You see, when Missouri requested statehood, we had to have debates. We had to talk. We had to compromise. Well, the Missouri Compromise says, look, we're going to add in these 2 new states, but we're also going to draw this line, the 3630 compromise line. And that line, of course, was to stretch across the entirety of what would become the United States. Okay? And basically what it said was that any state south of the 3630 parallel line can be open to slavery, and anything north of the 3630 line, other than Missouri, cannot have slavery. And so the Missouri Compromise is attempting to address this issue for the future, right? No, if you are a state that gets organized above the 3630 line or north of it, you cannot have slave. Yes, if you're organized below that line, then yes, it can be open to slavery. Now, what we're going to find, and we're going to see this time and time again, is that the Missouri Compromise is basically going to be ignored by a number of people. Numerous arguments will be made about why the Missouri Compromise, or why states that get organized should be permitted to have slavery, and we're going to be talking about some of those. But just keep this Missouri Compromise in the forefront of your mind, because it's going to come up time and time again, and it's going to bring about a lot of tension and problems for people because, of course, Southerners and their interests, right, they want to see slavery move. Northerners and their interests do not want to see slavery move. And I will say this. Those in the North who wanted the West open or free of slavery didn't necessarily approach this topic because they had, some moral outrage about slavery. Many individuals who formed a political party known as the Liberty Party and later the Free Soil Party, they were just about as racist as anybody else gets. They didn't want to compete with slavery because economically, if you're a poor farmer, you can't compete with slavery. And so, the Free Soil Party and many in the North who say, no, we shouldn't have slavery extend, they're not approaching that from a moral position. They're approaching that from we just don't want black people around us. It's economically not viable for us, and frankly, we just don't like black people, so we don't want them here. Okay, that's where a lot of that comes from. Okay, and I think that nuance isn't played out very well in your high school and junior high courses. I think they sort of paint this picture that everyone in the North hated slavery and they detested it, and they were all abolitionists, and everyone in the South were, going to die for the institution of slavery, and that is simply not an accurate picture. Okay, but what the Missouri Compromise demonstrates, as we've already said here, is that when slavery potentially was going to expand and go west, that caused some problems. The Missouri Compromise, as many other things that we will see, highlights that yes, slavery and its growth were central to what would eventually become the Civil War. Okay, but as I already mentioned, it's not the only tension or the only cause. There was another one. There's quite a few of them, but we're just going to highlight one other, and that is depicted through the nullification crisis. So let's take a look at that now. So we mentioned the nullification crisis earlier when we talked about Andrew Jackson's presidency. Andrew Jackson is elected to the presidency in 1828, and he will preside during a really important period of American history. But one of the things that happens during his administration is a tariff is going to be put into place. And this tariff will eventually be referred to as the Tariff of Abominations by many in the South, especially those in South Carolina. The notes here state, by the late 1820s, the North was becoming increasingly industrialized, and the South remained predominantly agricultural. And, we already saw this when we looked at the Industrial Revolution lecture, so I'm going to assume that you've got the context for that already. But one thing I do want to just point out again is that even though the North was industrial and the South wasn't, this didn't mean that the North didn't benefit from slavery. American capitalism and the Industrial Revolution was fueled and created by, in many ways, the backs of slaves. Okay, so although we have what might appear to be a dichotomous economic system taking place in the United States. In other words, that we've got one economy in the North and one economy in the South. The both of them fed off of one another and benefited deeply from one another. That connection, however, didn't necessarily null and void tensions and other issues that would begin to develop. But I just want to make clear that even though the North is industrializing and the South isn't, there's still a connection there. However, there's also some tensions that are going to be created by this, because in the North, what you have is a free wage system. It's free labor, right? It's wage labor, right? And in the South, you have forced labor. And what's interesting is that in many ways, as the Industrial Revolution began to grow and as American capitalism began to develop, slave owners in the South will actually become very critical of the free wage labor system. And in fact, one of the arguments that you'll begin to hear slave owners make is that slavery is a positive good. In fact, John C. Calhoun once argued that slavery was a positive good for the slave because the slave owner, the white man, was effectively benevolent to the slave. That, when the slave got old, the slave owner cared for them, they fed them, they clothed them, right? And by contrast, the free labor in the North, even though they're getting paid a wage, the tasks under which they are forced to work are hazardous. They are unsafe. You are forced to work very long, grueling hours for little pay. You're manipulated. You're taken advantage of. And, some of the things, of course, are true. Yes, the tasks were difficult. Yes, the conditions were unsafe, oftentimes unsanitary. Yes, the wage oftentimes was low, but you're free. You see, and there's the difference. But I digress there. Let me get back now to the nullification crisis. So what happens, and the reason why it's important to understand this dichotomy between the economy is that the United States in the 1820s, 1830s, was still in its infant stages with respects to industrialization. Britain was far further along in their industrial development than the United States was, and consequently, it was cheaper to import British goods, okay, instead of buying things made within the United States. So to give you sort of an example of this, if we think about, we're going to open a t-shirt factory in the United States today, and we're going to open one up in China. Okay, it's much cheaper to produce the goods in China and import them into the United States than it is to make them in the United States and purchase them in home. Okay, and so therefore China's going to make our money, not the United States. Well, in the 1820s, 1830s, what the U.S. wants to do is it wants to be able to compete with England. And so what it did in 1828, it created a tariff, which meant that anytime that you imported goods from a foreign country, predominantly England, those goods would be highly taxed. And what that's going to do is it's going to jack the price significantly up on the imported good, so that the imported item from England, for instance, becomes more expensive for Southerners, for anybody, to purchase, and therefore it's cheaper to buy American-made goods. These tariffs make it, what am I trying to say here? The tariff of 1828 was put into place in order to protect American industries as they began to build, as they began to grow, okay? In order for them to be able to compete with England, okay? It'd be like putting a mom and pop hardware store right next to a Home Depot. Right? How is that mom and pop hardware store going to be able to compete with Home Depot? Well, the way you do that is you tax the crap out of anything that comes out of Home Depot. Okay, it says in 1828, Congress passed a high protective tariff that infuriated the southern states because they felt it only benefited the industrialized North. In fact, in many ways, that's exactly what happened. It says this tariff benefited American producers of cloth, and those American producers of cloth were in the North. It shrunk English demand for Southern raw cotton, and it increased the final costs of finished goods to American buyers. So, this ultimately was not going to behoove Southerners. And so many within the South, especially South Carolina, called the 1828 tariff the tariff of abominations. And ultimately what they're going to do is they're going to say, hey, look, this tariff is not good for South Carolina. We as South Carolina have the right to nullify this law. And that's exactly what they're going to ultimately do. All right, let's move on. All right. According to Tyndall, he writes the following. He says, most South Carolinians, including John C. Calhoun, who is pictured here. And by the way, John C. Calhoun was the Vice President of the United States. And interestingly, John C. Calhoun had supported tariffs in the 18-teens. But he recognized that if he was going to have any political base whatsoever, any future in South Carolina, he was going to have to move against the 1828 tariff, again, what the South Carolinians called the Tariff of Abominations. And so he's going to become sort of the spokeschild, if you will, spearheading this nullification crisis. But Tyndall writes, most South Carolinians blamed the protective tariff for raising the price of manufactured goods from Europe. Insofar as tariffs discouraged the sale of foreign goods in the United States, they reduced the ability of British and French traders to buy Southern cotton. This situation worsened already existing problems of low cotton prices and farmland exhausted from perennial planting. Compounding the South Carolinians' malaise was growing anger over the North's moral criticism of slavery. Hardly had the country emerged from the Missouri controversy, when Charleston, South Carolina was thrown into panic by the Denmark-Vesey slave insurrection of 1822, and through the uprising was quickly and brutally put down. The unexpected passage of the Tariff of 1828, called the Tariff of Abominations by his critics, left Calhoun no choice but to join those in opposition. Okay, and in fact, John C. Calhoun, like many within South Carolina, basically saw the federal government as only existing at the will of the states, right? It was South Carolina, among other states, that created the federal government, and therefore the states, not the federal government, had the right to make its own decisions about what it would do. It says, therefore, if a state found a federal law unconstitutional and detrimental to its sovereign interests, it would have the right to nullify that law within its borders. Calhoun advanced the position that a state could declare a national law void. Now, I will tell you, South Carolina threatened to secede from the Union over the Tariff of Abominations, over the 1828 tariff. Calhoun comes in and says, no, we don't necessarily need to secede from the Union, but we can nullify this tariff, this law. Now, again, this has on its face nothing to do with slavery. What this nullification crisis is ultimately about is about states' rights. Does South Carolina have the right to nullify a federal law? According to Calhoun and South Carolinians, yes, they did. According to Andrew Jackson, no, they did not. Okay? Ultimately, the federal government was the supreme law of the land, not the states. And so, in this particular case, it's not necessarily slavery that's causing the division. At least not on its face, it's not causing the division. What's causing the division here, very much unlike the Missouri Compromise, is an issue of states' rights. Okay? Now, I will say this. You can tie the nullification crisis back to slavery because John C. Calhoun and other nullifiers, as they were called, were afraid that the power that the federal government used to pass the tariff would be also used to end slavery. And so part of the outrage for these nullifiers is not just the tariff itself, which they see as being problematic, and in many ways it was, but they see in that authority the authority to end slavery. And so they want to make sure that if they can nullify the Tariff of Abominations, then if the federal government chose to end slavery, then if they could nullify the tariff, then they could also keep their slaves. Okay? So what basically happens is tensions begin to build between John C. Calhoun and Andrew Jackson. Andrew Jackson, during the time that the nullification crisis was beginning to build, hadn't made it clear which side he would fall on. During a dinner, which was held in honor of Thomas Jefferson's birthday, Jackson made his position very clear. He toasts to the Union and says our Union must be held together. And so tension begins to build between Calhoun, vice president, and Andrew Jackson, president. And ultimately, when Jackson is re-elected in 1832, Calhoun will not be brought on as the vice president. But what happens is Henry Clay, the great compromiser coming out of the House of Representatives, he attempts to address the issue that South Carolina has, and he passes another tariff. And the tariff, I believe, was passed in 1832 by Henry Clay. And the idea here was that this new tariff that Henry Clay brought in, it would lower the duty, it would lower the tax. And hopefully, what Clay is really hoping to do here with this new tariff is to say, okay, look, we get that you didn't like the 1828 tariff because the tax was too high on these imports, so we're going to pass a new tariff in the 1830s, and this is going to help to reduce the tariff itself. Okay, it says Jackson. I'm reading out of Tyndall's book. It says Andrew Jackson sent federal soldiers to South Carolina. In fact, Jackson, when South Carolina passes an ordinance of secession, or not secession, I apologize. When South Carolina eventually passes their ordinance of nullification, Andrew Jackson demands that Congress pass something called the Force Bill, where he was going to send troops in. Luckily, he didn't have to do that because Clay ultimately comes in, brings in a new compromise, and boom, the situation is de-escalated. But the point here, the larger point with the nullification crisis, is that this is an issue that caused division and separation, not necessarily over slavery, but over states' rights. Okay, so as mentioned, there is this Tariff of Abominations in 1828. South Carolinians don't like it. So what happens is that in 1832, this gentleman that you see pictured here, Henry Clay, he recognizes that the tensions are beginning to build. And so he says, okay, let's try and compromise. Let's try and come to some kind of compromise. And indeed, Henry Clay is known as the great compromiser because he was part of very many of the compromises that the United States gets engaged in that we have been and will talk about. But he comes in and he says, okay, in 1832, we're going to pass a new tariff. It's going to be a tariff that has less taxation than the tariff of 1828. As it says here, in 1832, Henry Clay responded by pushing through Congress a new tariff bill, one with lower rates, but South Carolinians said not good enough. And so what they do is in 1832, on November 24th, South Carolina will pass its ordinance of nullification, okay, which basically states we in South Carolina are going to nullify this tariff of 1828, and we're going to nullify the tariff of 1832. It says here in Tyndall's book, white South Carolinians living in the only state where slaves were a majority of the population feared that the federal authority to impose tariffs might eventually be used to end slavery. And again, this is where you can really connect the nullification crisis back to the institution of slavery. Okay? He goes on to state, in the state elections of 1832, attention centered on the nullification issue. The nullifiers took the initiative in organization and agitation, and the newly formed Unionist Party was left with distinguished leaders but little public support. A state convention overwhelmingly adopted an ordinance of nullification that repudiated the federal tariff acts of 1828 and 1832, the one that we just mentioned here by Henry Clay, and it forbade federal agents in Charleston to collect the tariff duties after February 1st, 1833. Now, with the passage of the South Carolina Ordinance of Nullification, Jackson is going to respond by asking, and I mentioned this on the previous slide, but as a review, he's going to ask Congress for a force bill, which basically says, let me use force if necessary to compel the South Carolinians to pay this tariff. Okay? Ultimately, he's not going to have to use force, but that's how tense this got. Okay? Let's move on. It says that Andrew Jackson regarded this states' rights challenge as so serious that he asked Congress to enact legislation permitting him to use federal troops to enforce federal laws in the face of nullification. This was known as the Force Bill, and that was passed in 1833. It was passed at the same time that Henry Clay came in and asked for yet another Compromise. Remember, he comes in 1832, says, all right, let's pass the tariff of 1832. It gets passed. South Carolinians say, not good enough. We're going to nullify. So they nullify. Jackson responds with the force bill. Clay comes back to the table, says, all right, we're going to pass another tariff, which is passed in 1833. And what this new tariff does is it was a gradual reduction on the tariff over 10 years so that the tariff would reach the level of the 1816 tariff. Okay. Ultimately, both sides are able to save face. In the end, Jackson isn't going to have to use the force bill, and South Carolinians were willing to accept the 1833 tariff because in the end, it reduced the duties rather significantly. Okay. Let's move on. Ultimately, following the 1833 tariff, it says South Carolina repealed its nullification measure, but then spitefully nullified the force bill. Jackson ignored that action. It says, although the issue died down, the idea did not entirely go away and gradually morphed into the principle of nullification of the Union itself. Now, if you take a look at this political cartoon, you've got John C. Calhoun standing there in the middle with his hands going towards the crown, and there it's called despotism. And this is a political cartoon which is anti-nullify. This is anti-Calhoun. They basically viewed John C. Calhoun as a despot, as a tyrant, that nullification itself was tyrannical, it was unconstitutional, and it was something that was terrible. Okay, you can see it says disunion, deception, civil war, treason. The South Carolina Ordinance of Nullification. In other words, people like Andrew Jackson and those who would support him, they saw the Ordinance of Nullification as treasonous, as deceptive, causing disunion, and ultimately it would lead to civil war. And ultimately, John C. Calhoun is the tyrant, he's the despot pushing this forward. Again, this is significant because this creates division within the United States. But it doesn't on its face have anything to do with slavery. And so it's important to understand this, because what we want to know and what we want to understand is that slavery was not the only cause here. All right, and I think I've beaten that horse to death now, so I don't want to continue on that. But I do want to make that very clear. All right. Okay, so up to this point, we've got the Missouri Compromise, which demonstrates that slavery is a key issue with the oncoming of the Civil War. And to be honest, pretty much everything that we're going to look at from here on forward is going to be connected to slavery more directly. Okay, but you also got within the nullification crisis a moment in American history where the Union almost became dissolved. I mean, South Carolina threatened to secede. I mean, you've got the issue here: treason, civil war, disunion, right? But that is largely over an issue of states' rights and federalism. All right. Does South Carolina have the right to nullify this law? Not according to Jackson. All right. Let's move on. Okay, now on to something that we haven't talked about before, and that would be the Wilmot Proviso. And basically what you need to know, some context here, is that we have the Mexican-American War going on, right, 1846 to 48, and we've talked about the Mexican-American War already, so again, you've got that context. But the idea is that to fulfill our manifest destiny, right, we need to obtain land, we need to obtain territory. And, you know, you could do that by treating with Native Americans. You could take the land through war, which is what we're doing here. You could purchase the land, as we did with Louisiana Purchase, right? But one of the things that's going to happen following the Mexican-American War is the United States is going to acquire a fair chunk of land. And you can see the blue territory was the stuff, or was the region ceded to the United States in 1848 following the Mexican-American War. Okay, and if we go back and think about the Missouri Compromise, one of the things I'd ask you to think about right now, and perhaps you can even answer it if you want, is according to the Missouri Compromise, right, this new blue territory that we've obtained, which is, you know, parts of Nevada and Arizona and California and what have you, according to the Missouri Compromise, the issue of slavery and free state versus slave state, it's already been addressed. But there's going to be a provision made which will challenge the Missouri Compromise. Okay? Now, in 1846, okay, gentleman by the name of Wilmot, okay, David Wilmot, he's a congressman from Pennsylvania. He sets forth a proposition, okay. It says here that the Wilmot Proviso was designed to eliminate slavery within the land acquired as a result of the Mexican War. Now, when Wilmot gives his provision, the Mexican War is still going on. It's all hypothetical, okay? But as we know from hindsight and from this map, that we do acquire a lot of new territory. It says here that soon after the war began, President James K. Polk sought the appropriation of $2 million as part of a bill to negotiate the terms of a treaty. Fearing the addition of a pro-slave territory, Pennsylvania Congressman David Wilmot proposed his amendment to this bill that Polk was putting forward. And basically what David Wilmot said was this: we are okay with obtaining new territory from Mexico, but that territory should all be free. There should not be slavery in any of the new territory. And his reasoning was somewhat humanitarian to a degree. He argues that Mexico had already abolished slavery, and therefore it would be problematic to reinstate it in this newly held territory. Okay. Now, of course, you can imagine that this is going to upset Southerners in a very major way. Right? Southerners are fighting in this war just like everyone else is, and of course their interests are to move west, and naturally they would take their slaves with them. We have to understand that slaves were regarded as chattel, as property, and so if you were to move west, you would take your cow and your cattle with you, so therefore you would take your property with you. You would take your slaves with you as well. But what Wilmot is suggesting is that all of this new blue territory that the United States is going to acquire, it should not be open to slavery. Okay. Now that, of course, challenges the Missouri Compromise, because the Missouri Compromise says, hey, anything south of the 3630 parallel line can be open to slavery. Wilmot Proviso would say, no, it can't. It states here at the bottom, it inflamed the growing controversy over slavery, and its underlying principle helped bring about the formation of the Republican Party in 1854. And indeed, this issue over slavery and westward expansion and manifest destiny, it caused massive fissures within the Democratic Party. So that Southern Democrats and Northern Democrats began to break from one another. The issue over slavery and westward expansion actually caused the complete decline of the Whig Party, and it brought about a new party, the Republican Party, which was formed on an anti-slavery platform. But one of the things we have to understand is the Southerners' perspective, right? Wilmot says it should be open, no slaves there. Okay, it should be completely open because slavery has already been abolished, and therefore we should not bring it back. Well, what do Southerners argue? Okay, again, we go back to John C. Calhoun. And I'm reading now from James McPherson's Battle Cry of Freedom, page 57. He writes, Southerners challenged the constitutionality of the Wilmot Proviso. Admittedly, precedent seemed to sanction congressional exclusion. In fact, if we take a look at Northwest Ordinances of 1787, if we look at the Louisiana Purchase, if we look at the Missouri Compromise, each and every one of these resulted in slavery not being allowed to spread. Okay, and so when you take a look at the Wilmot Proviso, right, it would seem as if that's the way it's going to go. It would seem as if this new territory isn't going to be open to slavery, because that's kind of the way the Congress and the federal government had always gone. Okay. McPherson goes on to state, though, however, but in February 1847, Senator John C. Calhoun introduced resolutions denying the right of Congress to exclude slave property from the territories. In other words, what John C. Calhoun is going to argue is that the Wilmot Proviso, indeed any action that forbids slavery from extending, is a violation of the Constitution, because according to the Fifth Amendment, citizens have the right to property. And what are slaves? They are property. And so the Southerners' argument is one that says, hey, the Wilmot Proviso is unconstitutional because it denies the right of property. Okay. Tyndall writes the following things. He says, Calhoun, made no apologies for holding slaves and insisted that slaveholders had an unassailable right to take their slaves into any territory. Wilmot's effort to exclude slaves from territories acquired from Mexico, Calhoun declared, would violate the Fifth Amendment, which forbids Congress to deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. What does the Wilmot Proviso do? Technically, the Wilmot Proviso doesn't get voted on. The House of Representatives, which tended to be more northern interests, they passed the Wilmot Proviso, but when it gets to the Senate, it dies. Okay, and it actually doesn't get passed at all. Abraham Lincoln, who was in Congress at this time, said that he voted on the Wilmot Proviso in various forms at least 40 different times, but it doesn't get passed. But what the Wilmot Proviso does is it reopens the discussion that the Missouri Compromise had sort of closed. The question of new territories and slavery, right? According to the Missouri Compromise, that question had already been solved. Above the line, no slaves. Below the line, yes slaves. Wilmot Proviso reopens this particular question. But it also brings about a new impulse. It helps to establish what we call the Free Soil Party. Free land, free labor, free people. Okay, and the Free Soil Coalition, the Free Soil Party, came about in large part because they wanted to see slavery stop as far as westward expansion is concerned. They didn't want to have slaves in the new western territories. And again, this isn't because of some moral outrage they have. It's because they're racist and they don't want to be around black people. They don't want to compete with the institution of slavery. It's incredibly difficult, right, for a free yeoman farmer, if you will, to compete with the institution of slavery. Okay. Now, to talk about this a bit more, I have a video on politics, free soil, and the Civil War. So before moving on to the next slide, please take a look at that video so you have a sense of one of the ramifications of the Wilmot Proviso, and that is the development of the Free Soil Party and the impact it had on the 1848 and even 1852 elections. Okay. All right. Let's move on. All right, now that you have watched the film on the Free Soil Party, and you have that, let's move on to something else, which is very similar to the Wilmot Proviso, and that, of course, is the bringing in of new territory, right? In 1848, gold is discovered in California, and this is going to result in massive migration, not only within the United States, but from other countries as well, specifically China. And people begin to move into California in massive numbers. And this onslaught of Americans into California really expedites in 1849 and 1850. So much so that by 1850, California is going to request to become a state. Okay. When that happens, it raises the question that the Missouri request for statehood raised. Should California be permitted in as a free state or a slave state? Okay. The problem with the Missouri Compromise when dealing with California is that California rests both above and below the Missouri Compromise line. Okay. So do we break California up into two states? What is it that we do? Okay. Well, we compromise. Okay. It says the compromise was the last major involvement in national affairs for Senators Henry Clay, Daniel Webster, and John C. Calhoun, all of whom had exceptional careers in the Senate. Calhoun died the same year, and Clay and Webster would die 2 years later. By the way, I am reading off of a web page at the moment. It says here that at first Clay introduced an omnibus bill covering these measures. Calhoun attacked the plan and demanded that the North cease its attempts to limit slavery. Okay, one of the things that of course, California wants to be as a free state, and so it raises this question again: free state, slave state. What's it going to be? Okay. Ultimately, we get a compromise. We get the Compromise of 1850. Okay. It says this resulted from the desire of those in California, many who had come as a result of the gold rush, who wished for the territory to become a state. Like the Missouri Compromise, the question of free or slave was now back on the table. Okay. So ultimately, what happens? The thing that happens is this. All right. A number of things are going to take place. Okay. The Missouri Compromise, or I'm sorry, the Compromise of 1850 consisted of laws which, one, admitted California as a free state. Okay, California is going to come in as a free state, right? It created Utah and New Mexico territories with the question of slavery in each to be determined by popular sovereignty. So the Utah Act was passed establishing a new territory which would be governed by popular sovereignty. Now, popular sovereignty is a term you need to be aware of, because basically what popular sovereignty does is it says the people of the region can choose for themselves what they're going to be, non-slave or slave-holding state. Now, that, of course, null and voids the Missouri Compromise, because if a state can choose to have slavery, and that state happens to lie north of the Missouri Compromise, then, you know, the Missouri Compromise basically becomes null and void. And indeed, popular sovereignty null and voids the Missouri Compromise. Okay. The slave trade is abolished in Washington, D.C., and then finally, and really this is the only thing that slaveholders were able to tangibly say they achieved with the Compromise of 1850, a new Fugitive Slave Act was passed, which put the matter of capturing escaped slaves into the hands of the federal government. This new fugitive slave law was incredibly harsh, and it created for a lot of controversy. In and of itself, the new fugitive slave law created division within the United States. I mean, ultimately, if we think of slavery as being the elephant in the room, after 1850, that elephant doesn't ever go away. The thing of it is that we needed to shoot the elephant and get it out of the room, but we weren't willing to do that. We weren't willing to end slavery. And so every time that we get a new state, be it Missouri, be it California, be it Utah, be it New Mexico, whatever it is, we are going to constantly have to have some kind of a debate over whether or not slavery can exist there. Okay? And for this reason, this is why I say it's not necessarily the institution of slavery in and of itself. People were, not everybody by any means, obviously abolitionists were not content to have slavery exist at all, but many anti-slavery folk would have been just fine allowing slavery to exist in the states where it already did, so long as it didn't grow into new states. And I think that's one of the things you get out of the Compromise of 1850, is that anti-slavery folk, the Free Soil Party, abolitionists, they don't want to see this institution spread. And so every time we get new land, every time we move west, the question of will slavery grow there as well, that's what comes up. We saw it in the Missouri Compromise. We saw it in the Wilmot Proviso. We see it here with the Compromise of 1850. Okay. All right. Let's move on. All right. One thing I wanted to say, and I just remembered to say it here now, about the Fugitive Slave Act is that the act really didn't just reinforce the returning of slaves to slave owners, at least those who may have escaped. There were fugitive slave laws on the books already, but the Fugitive Slave Act that accompanied the Compromise of 1850 offered a very strong temptation to actually kidnap free blacks. Indeed, one of the things that the law did was it denied alleged fugitives a jury trial. So, you know, if you were someone who came north and you wanted extra slaves, you could kidnap a free black, and because the new Fugitive Slave Act denied them a jury trial, they could just be brought into slavery without any recourse. And so this is part of the reason why that particular act was so heinous and caused so much division. In many ways, it caused a lot of division in the state of Massachusetts, and indeed Massachusetts attempted to sort of go against the Fugitive Slave Act, although not always successfully. So I just wanted to make that clear. All right. All right, the last topic for today's lecture is going to be the Kansas-Nebraska Act, and later what becomes known as Bleeding Kansas, so that you can sort of get the lay of the land, the terrain here. All the states in green are slave states. All the states in purple are free states. Of course, California, Oregon, and Washington Territory are free. You can see the Utah Territory and the New Mexico Territory. Those were opened to slavery by principle of popular sovereignty. That was because of the Compromise of 1850. And then the pink stuff, the Kansas and Nebraska Territory, that gets opened up to slavery by principle of popular sovereignty, and that's going to happen in 1854, and it's going to happen as a result of the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Okay, now one of the things that the United States debated hotly over was where to build railroads, right? Wherever the railroad is built, or wherever any railroad is built, the people of that region are going to benefit from said construction of said railroad. Well, in the 1850s, 1840s, 1830s, 1800s really, there is a strong desire to build some type of a transcontinental railroad and to link the country together. There's also commercial interest in Asia, which helped spark a growing desire for a transcontinental railroad, right? They wanted to connect the eastern seaboard to the Pacific Ocean as a means to bring goods from one market to another. And so ultimately, there's constant debate, constant discussion about where a railroad should be built. Okay, well, in the 1850s, Senator Stephen Douglas from Illinois, we'll get back to him here next week, but Stephen Douglas wants to build a transcontinental railroad, and he wants to have a railroad where the eastern terminus comes out of Chicago. And so what he is going to propose in 1854 is to begin to build a railroad with the eastern terminus in Chicago and moving west. And what he's going to do is he's going to propose that the Nebraska Territory get organized. And the Nebraska Territory, if you take a look at this map, initially it was part of the Louisiana Purchase. But we've created states out of some of that already. But the Nebraska Territory at one point included the stuff that is also called the Kansas Territory. Okay, but eventually, as we can see here, it's going to be broken apart. According to Tyndall, he writes, in 1854, as chairman of the Committee on Territories, Senator Douglas proposed another Nebraska bill, which became the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Unlike his other bills, this one included the entire unorganized portion of the Louisiana Purchase, extending to the Canadian border. Political necessity then began to transform Douglas's proposal from a railroad bill into a pro-slavery bill, thus reopening the controversy over the extension of slavery into the territories. To grant territorial status to Nebraska required the support of Southerners in Congress, and to win that support, Douglas needed to make some concessions on slavery in the new territories. This he did by writing the principle of popular sovereignty into the bill, allowing voters in each of the territories to decide whether to allow slavery. And so, in many ways, what the Kansas-Nebraska Act effectively does is it actually kills the Missouri Compromise. And you can see that Missouri Compromise line located there just above the Indian Territory and by Texas, right? Basically, popular sovereignty, Kansas-Nebraska Act destroys that. It kills it, okay? Basically, as it says here in Tyndall, Douglas's proposal to repeal the Missouri Compromise was less than a week old when 6 anti-slavery congressmen published a protest. And, of course, Southerners are going to publish a protest because what the Missouri Compromise line did was it guaranteed slavery in certain areas. What popular sovereignty does is it does not guarantee slavery. It potentially allows for it, but doesn't guarantee it. And basically what the Kansas-Nebraska Act does is it creates further division, okay? Nebraska chooses to be a free state, okay? Kansas, on the other hand, there are too many competing interests in Kansas. And we also have to recognize when we take a look at this map that Kansas is just adjacent to Missouri. And Missouri is a slave state, and many within Missouri expected to move into Kansas once it had been organized into a territory. That had been something that Missourians had intended to do for many, many years. Well, now that this territory, now called Kansas, was organized, many Missourians are going to move into Kansas. Okay. The problem with that, however, is you have a lot of free soil people in Kansas as well. And Kansas is going to become a center of violence and tragedy because these two competing interests, one free, one pro-slave, are going to butt up against one another, and they're going to smash into each other. It is like an immovable object hits an unstoppable force, and this is why the area of Kansas becomes known as Bleeding Kansas. Because of the Kansas-Nebraska Act, because of popular sovereignty, we're going to see, if you will, kind of the opening chapter to the American Civil War. People are going to die, buildings are going to be destroyed, all because you have some people who say, we as Kansas want to be slave, and you have others, we in Kansas don't want to have slavery. Okay? And in some ways, I think the Kansas-Nebraska Act almost makes the Civil War inevitable. But what's going on in Kansas is a continuation of what we saw with the Compromise of 1850. It's a continuation of what we saw with the Wilmot Proviso. It's a continuation of the Missouri Compromise. It's this idea that we get new territory. What will it be? Slave or free? Well, in Kansas, in many ways, it's going to end up being both, and Kansas will begin to bleed. Let's move on. All right, Bleeding Kansas. It says the passage of the Kansas-Nebraska Act would not only prove divisive, but it illustrated the flaws of popular sovereignty. And in fact, you see this political cartoon. It says, forcing slavery down the throat of a free soiler. You can see you've got the Democrats on one side shoving a slave down the throat of someone who looks a lot like Abraham Lincoln. They're forcing slavery down the throat of those in Kansas who don't want it. Okay. Again, you've got these competing interests in Kansas, some who want slavery, some who don't. And this particular cartoon highlights the fact. Okay. It says, while Nebraska chose to be a free state, Kansas, on the other hand, had too many opposing views, and by the end, many would die in the struggle over free or slave. Okay. It's crazy what happens, right? You've got two competing interests. What's going to be? What do you think Kansas is going to end up being? The answer to that is kind of both. Okay, kind of both. All right, it says problems in Kansas began in 1854. Not shocking, right? Because it was organized into a territory in 1854. And in 1854, if you're going to organize a territory, you have to send in some type of a territorial governor. And this is when problems began. Okay, when this first governor of Kansas came in 1854, he orders that a census be taken, and he orders for an election to be taken so that a territorial legislature could be created. And this was going to be done in 1855. Tyndall writes the following. He says, when Kansas's first federal governor arrived in 1854, he found several thousand settlers there. He ordered a census and scheduled an election for a territorial legislature. On the election day, several thousand people from Missouri, which we call border ruffians, okay? On election day, several thousand border ruffians crossed over from Missouri, illegally swept the polls for the pro-slavery forces, and vowed to kill, quote, every, quote, goddamned abolitionist in the territory. So what happens? This governor comes in, he's like, okay, we're going to have a census, let's count the people, and in 1855, we're going to have an election, right? Many of the people who are in Kansas are free soilers. They don't want to have slaves in Kansas. And if the people who were already in Kansas were allowed to vote for themselves, Kansas would have been swept as a free state right off the bat. Not a problem. The problem was that in 1855, when the election happened, these Missourians, these pro-slavery border ruffians, sweep into Kansas. They skew the election results. They basically create a pro-slavery legislature. They promised to kill every abolitionist, and in fact, the governor of Kansas condemns the action, says, yeah, you know, it was bad, the vote was skewed, but he doesn't do anything else because he doesn't want to be killed. I mean, quite literally, he's afraid of being murdered in his bed by these border ruffians. What happens is that anyone who was anti-slavery, who was in the legislature, they are kicked out, and basically this pro-slavery legislature makes it almost illegal to question slavery in the territory. They make it a capital offense to aid fugitive slaves. Okay? And so basically, a state that by everyone's imagination thought would be free has now been turned rather illegally into a slave state. Well, this pisses off and outrages free state advocates, these free soilers, those who don't want slavery in the state. So they refer to this pro-slavery legislature as bogus. And so these free state folks in 1855, they go to Topeka and they create for themselves their own free state government. And so basically what you got is one government that's pro-slavery in Kansas and one government that's free, non-slave holding in Kansas, and that's going to create some tension. That's going to create some problems, and eventually you're going to get a moment where a spark happens, an event happens, and Kansas is going to break basically out into warfare. Okay, let's see how that happens. It says, violence finally erupted in Kansas in May 1856 when a pro-slavery mob marched into the town of Lawrence, which was a free town, a non-slave holding town, and burned news presses, set fire to the governor's palace, stole property, and destroyed the Free State Hotel. This incident became known as the Sack of Lawrence, and it resulted in a small yet significant attack upon the pro-slavery headquarters at Potawatomi by a man named John Brown. Okay, and John Brown was an abolitionist, an ardent abolitionist. Some have argued that he was not mentally stable. I don't have hard evidence to suggest that he was bipolar or mentally unstable in some certain way, but I think he was highly, highly passionate, hated slavery, saw it as sin, and he viewed himself as God's agent, quite literally God's agent on earth to end the institution of slavery. So when John Brown hears about the Sack of Lawrence, he goes to Potawatomi. And the reason why he goes to Potawatomi is because there is where many pro-slavery folks were. Tyndall writes, the Sack of Lawrence resulted in just one casualty, but the excitement aroused a zealous free soiler named John Brown, who had a history of mental instability. 2 days after Lawrence was sacked, Brown set out with 4 of his sons and 3 other men for Potawatomi, the site of a pro-slavery settlement. Okay? When he gets there, he drags men out of their beds and hacks them to death with broadswords in front of their family. Let's move on. Here's John Brown on the right. It says, on the night of May 24th to the 25th, 1856, a small band of abolitionists led by John Brown murdered 5 pro-slavery men just north of here along Potawatomi Creek. This massacre in Bleeding, Kansas was one of the most famous events leading up to the American Civil War. Brown was later captured, tried, and hanged for his unsuccessful raid on Harper's Ferry, which we'll talk about a little bit later. But John Brown's attack at Potawatomi Creek is an example of the type of violence that would erupt, the type of bloodshed that would erupt in the American Civil War over the issue of slavery that we have basically been talking about this entire time, except for perhaps the nullification crisis. Okay. Now, this is just a fragment of the issues that are going on in the United States at this time. And so, of course, you'll want to read the pages that I've asked you to read in Chapter 14 to sort of get the broader picture, okay? But this brings us to an end of our first lecture for the causes of the Civil War. We will continue that next week. But now that we're done, what I want you to do is to watch the last video that I have for you. It's on westward expansion and the slavery and the causes of the Civil War. So please watch that video now. You're going to want to use that content to help address this week's and even next week's discussion board questions. So With that, I will leave you as I do with go in peace, be warm and filled. May the force be with you, live long and prosper, and may the odds forever be in your favor. Have a great week, guys.